In recent months, the killer disease AIDS has started to take a deadly toll among haemophiliacs in Britain. Over half have been infected with the AIDS virus after being treated with a National Health Service supplied clotting agent, factor VIII, designed to cure their blood disorder. 5 haemophiliacs have died so far as AIDS has become the greatest public health danger since World War II. The latest inquest was held earlier this month in Newcastle upon Tyne. Afterwards, at a press conference, Dr. Peter Jones outlined the growing problem doctors who prescribed factor VIII now face.
We've had 3 cases of AIDS in this city. One was Mr. McStay, who died in Scotland. Mr. Jefferson was the first patient with haemophilia who's died of AIDS in this city. A further haemophiliac has died of AIDS since then. I have one further patient with full-blown AIDS, and 20% of my patients show some form of physical abnormality which could be attributed to AIDS.
A wonder product, the clotting agent factor VIII concentrate, revolutionized life for haemophiliacs. They could treat themselves at home and lead a more normal life. But demand quickly outstripped what could be produced in Britain, so over 50% had to be imported, mostly from the United States. There, the product is made not from volunteer donors, as in Britain, but from those who sell the plasma from which factor VIII is made. These include homosexuals and drug addicts, now identified as the 2 groups most at risk from AIDS, a new disease which destroys the body's immune system, making infection potentially fatal. Last Friday, the Department of Health estimated that 2,500 haemophiliacs have been infected by the AIDS virus as a result of using imported factor VIII. 3 deaths since May herald the start of what doctors fear will be a rising number who will die over the next 3 years.
We do know from the figures, both in the United States and the United Kingdom, that AIDS is growing with a magnitude unequaled by any other disease, with the exception of the poliomyelitis epidemic in the 1940s in this country.
Tonight, World in Action examines how Britain came to rely on a product that was always known to have health risks and which now threatens the lives of an increasing number of those who were forced to rely on it. Haemophilia is a rare complaint affecting men. There are 4,500 sufferers in Britain. All lack the vital clotting ingredient in their blood, which prevents internal bleeding and crippling damage to their joints. John Prothero, aged 41, is a civil servant from London.
You never know, literally from one minute to the next, if you're going to start a bleed in a knee, an elbow, anywhere in your body. Must have been 30 or 40% of schooling I just missed, right through primary school and right up to A-levels at grammar school. With no treatment around, every time you got a bleed, you'd be off work for a couple of weeks or so.
Godfrey is a 41-year-old clock repairer from North Yorkshire.
First of all, you lose a very slight amount of movement and you get a little twinge of pain in that particular joint. Those are the early stages of a bleed. As the hours go by, the joint movement is increasingly reduced. It begins to start to get hot, extremely painful, and if it's a knee bleed, in a few hours, of course, you just cannot walk. And you're in agony from the pain of it.
What actually happened with your hand?
That was due to a bleed in the forearm when I was about 12-year-old. And there was no form of treatment then, effective form of treatment. And so it just had to bleed in until the pressure stopped itself. And of course it took months to subside. All the old, the blood to subside away. And I was left with that.
John Strutt is a 35-year-old local government officer from London. He's married with 2 children.
Gardening is a particular problem that you have to give serious consideration to before you undertake digging or any form of physical exertion. In my experience, prolonged digging would necessitate at least 1, maybe 2 fairly difficult bleeds.
Any social life was non-existent, and job-wise would have been very difficult. You couldn't say that you would be at work, say, tomorrow or next week, because you probably wouldn't. You may have a bleed.
I suppose the pre-treatment area could best be described as a bit of a nightmare in many respects. The constant episodes of bleeding, the severe pain lasting for anything from 4 to 6 weeks, and the prolonged periods of inactivity.
I suppose if I reached to be 20, 30, I would be very lucky. Indeed, yes. With all the hazards that there were, you would be very lucky to reach that area.
For haemophiliacs, the turning point in their lives was the British discovery of factor VIII concentrate. It is derived from plasma, the straw-coloured liquid which carries the red and white blood cells through the body. The traditional method of collecting plasma is from the voluntary blood donation sessions held in factories up and down the country. The red cells are used by hospitals for blood transfusions. The plasma is extracted and sent for processing into blood products like factor VIII. Because it comes from volunteer donors, in only a handful of cases has there been contamination with AIDS. The plasma is frozen after collection and sent to the laboratory at Elstree, north of London, which supplies 40% of the needs of England and Wales. Scotland has its own laboratory and does not import factor VIII. Factor VIII revolutionized life for the haemophiliac. He became his own doctor. He could treat himself at home. Only in emergency does he need hospital treatment. Factor VIII became a passport to a more normal life previously denied to haemophiliacs.
That's it.
Well, I now lead virtually a normal life. I travel wherever I want. I've been to all sorts of parts of the world that you would never even dream of going to in the old days, because you can carry the treatment material with you. And when a bleed starts, I treat it. It takes about half an hour by the time I've got the stuff out, made it up, injected it, cleared up, I go back to whatever I was doing before.
I earn my living. I have a social life, same as everybody else, without having to worry about whether I should do something in case I have a bleed. That no longer applies.
The supply of factor VIII began in 1969, but soon Britain could not collect sufficient plasma to produce enough. In the early 70s, the government started to import it from the United States and Austria. By 1975, imported factor VIII exceeded British supplies. A World in Action investigation in 1975 revealed that American factor VIII carried a high health risk because it was mainly made from the plasma of paid donors. Much of it was bought on the skid rows of America's big cities from drug addicts, alcoholics, and down and outs, all with a high risk of carrying the liver disease hepatitis. More recently, many of the donors have come from the groups most affected by AIDS. But even before the AIDS epidemic, British doctors were concerned about the source of the plasma for imported factor VIII. Many felt they still had to prescribe it because Britain failed to make enough. In Newcastle, Dr. Peter Jones pioneered the use of American factor VIII.
We had to. We had no choice. This is in retrospect, again, this is a catch-22 situation. We either imported or we didn't treat our haemophiliacs. And if you look at haemophiliacs in developing countries that have no factor VIII, it is appalling. I mean, 2/3 of them are dead before they reach their third decade, and the rest of them are lucky to survive without really severe and painful arthritis.
Another long-standing supporter of the use of imported factor VIII is Dr. Geoffrey Savage of St. Thomas's Hospital in London.
To remove treatment or to restrict treatment in these patients is to take away their independent lifestyle, their possibility of gaining employment and holding down employment, their possibilities of having a family, and of being able to offer a sensible contribution to society.
Because of concern about hepatitis, Labour Health Minister David Owen announced in 1975 a £500,000 programme to boost plasma collection. He pledged that Britain would be self-sufficient in factor VIII by 1977.
Well, that can only be as fast as buildings can be set up and equipment purchased. When I made the decision now, some time ago, It was thought that it would take us 3 years. We brought it down to 2 years, and maybe we can improve even on that. I've tried to make this switch to self-sufficiency as quickly as possible.
But by 1977, Britain had failed to meet the target of self-sufficiency and was importing even more Factor VIII than ever. With no further investment, imports were more than double the amount produced in Britain by 1980. Still not enough plasma was being collected, but the plant at Elstree was also too small to meet the demand. So in 1980, as a stopgap measure, the Conservative Health Minister Gerard Vaughan announced £1.25 million plan to double British production. Despite the ever-rising demand for Factor VIII, he saw no need for major expansion.
You either have to pull the whole building down and rebuild it totally, which I think would be unnecessary and a waste of money, or you have to change them steadily, and that is what we're doing. And I'm very proud of what we do at Elstree.
However, with British production of Factor VIII still lagging behind, the Conservative government's view changed in 1982. A £21 million plan was announced for a new plant at Elstree. The aim, once again, self-sufficiency, this time by 1985, to finally eliminate risky imports. But the decision came too late for British haemophiliacs. The first case of the deadly new disease, AIDS, was identified in the United States in 1978. Before long, British haemophiliacs had been infected by the AIDS virus transmitted through high-risk donors. This exposure to infection continued until this year, when the use of heat treatment made Factor VIII probably AIDS-free. But by then, most haemophiliacs had been exposed to Factor VIII, contaminated with AIDS. Today, Britain imports 60% of its Factor VIII. It buys from 5 companies, 4 American, 1 Austrian. US government documents obtained by World in Action reveal that 3 of the American companies have withdrawn blood products on 5 occasions since 1983 because a plasma donor had AIDS. On October the 31st, 1983, Cutter Laboratories in San Francisco issued an urgent drug recall for a batch of Factor VIII. The reason? The above lots contain plasma donated from an individual who subsequently was diagnosed as having acquired immune deficiency syndrome, AIDS. The donor, a 30-year-old homosexual male, donated 50 times through September 16, 1983. He died in October 1983. This Factor VIII had been sold nationwide and in foreign countries. Cutter denied this batch was sent to Britain. On August the 30th, 1984, Alpha Therapeutic in Los Angeles issued an important market withdrawal for the second time that year. The reason? A donor of source plasma was diagnosed as having AIDS. The donor sold plasma 19 times. Alpha records showed that the products were distributed to foreign accounts located in England, Federal Republic of Germany, and Austria. The suspect Factor VIII had been distributed by Alpha Therapeutic UK Limited, 12 Buckingham Street, London. Alpha would not say how much had been sold here, or if the foreign sales of the Factor VIII they withdrew in January 1984 had also been to Britain.
When you collect plasma from multiple donors, you only need 1 or 2 donors to be infected with a particular virus to contaminate the whole pool. And the commercial products are obtained from up to 30,000 donations of plasma. The National Health Service Factor VIII concentrate is obtained from upwards of 3,500. So just in that fact alone, one has a difference in magnitude of exposure.
The AIDS epidemic has spread like no other in recent years. In the United States, 11,300 cases have been reported so far. In the United Kingdom, 176. Already there have been 5,600 deaths in America and 83 deaths in Britain. Wherever American Factor VIII has been used, haemophiliacs have become AIDS victims. In the United States, 80 cases. In Europe, 23. In Britain, 7. AIDS is incurable. In the United States, 42 haemophiliacs have already died. In Britain, so far, 5 deaths. But the magnitude of the threat is only now starting to become clear. Hospital tests on 2,000 patients with severe haemophilia have shown that half to 3/4 have been infected by the AIDS virus. In Newcastle upon Tyne, 30 of Dr. Jones's 96 patients have possible AIDS symptoms, and 3 have already died from AIDS. We asked him how many more British haemophiliacs were likely to die.
Well, if you take it at its lowest level, 100 are going to get AIDS. If you take it at the highest level, which is the level for male homosexuals in the United States, then perhaps 200 of them will get AIDS.
The failure to meet the demand for factor VIII and so have to import 60% at a cost of £5 million a year is remarkable because Britain pioneered the concept of the volunteer blood transfusion service.
Given that we have over 1 million people who give blood every year, why did we fail to provide enough of the raw material?
Well, I think in many ways the estimates of what was required escalated very rapidly, more rapidly than the transfusion service was able to accommodate. And of course there was the problems with respect to the ability to fractionate all the material that could have been collected from transfusion centres.
But doesn't it seem that somebody somewhere made a mistake in the sense that we should have made such a tremendous underestimate of the amount that will be required? Like the difference between 1/3 and 2/3?
Yes, well, I don't think you can pin mistakes on things. I mean, this is the development of medicine. You may say that we were slow to react to the situation, but I think one has to recognize now that there is an urge to correct this situation.
But do you think, therefore, that there are people who are to blame for what is now happening as far as the haemophiliac population is concerned of AIDS?
I could give you an angry answer. I think that those politicians who pretended that we could be self-sufficient in the early days, pretended that the resources behind the blood transfusion service were sufficient to make us self-sufficient. If blame lies anywhere, then it lies with them. What's
your reaction been to the fact that haemophiliacs have started to die in this country from using the imported factor VIII?
Total horror. I mean, I actually don't distinguish between different groups of AIDS sufferers in my sympathy for them. It's an appalling disease. I don't actually have views which say it's some kind of judgment on the conduct of homosexuals and so on, but it has to be said that in the case of a haemophiliac who has a serious health hazard already, he actually acquires the infection as a result of medical treatment, which is an appalling thought. I'm glad that so few have so far died. I'm sorry that so many have been infected, and that is the reason why we're driving on with the investment at Elstree, and we're driving on with every other step we can to get the collection of blood made safer.
While you've been Minister of Health, we've continued to import more and more of the product from these dubious donors.
That's right, because it's the only available source. Without factor VIII, obviously, the haemophiliacs would be at even more serious risk. But we realized, and I certainly realized, this is a very worrying situation. We're buying factor VIII from sources where we cannot guarantee its purity.
Once the test for infection by the AIDS virus has proved positive, the worry for haemophiliacs is waiting to see if they will develop the killer disease. In Newcastle, for 71 out of 93 severe haemophiliacs, the test was positive. At St Thomas's Hospital in London, it proved positive for 120 out of 150.
As far as they themselves are concerned, it's a pretty shattering thing to have to live with, because although, as a doctor, looking at the American evidence, I can assure them that 90–95% chance is that they're going to be perfectly all right. The adults, at least, have got to make fundamental changes in the way that they live, particularly with a view to their sexual lives, because of this marker in their bloodstreams. So it's not a very nice thing to have to tell patients and their families.
Just how real is the risk of transmitting AIDS has been highlighted by the case of American Patrick Burke. He contracted AIDS from using contaminated factor VIII. Before this was diagnosed, he transmitted the AIDS virus to his wife, who now has symptoms of the disease. She in turn passed on the virus to their son, born last year. The boy has now developed AIDS.
What exactly is the risk that in fact someone who has the AIDS virus could transmit it to their wife or girlfriend or to a child?
The figures amongst haemophilics are very scanty, but generally speaking, I think from American data, One is thinking in terms of about 5% transmission rate to sexual partners.
So it's obviously a very real risk.
It is a risk.
The first evidence of that risk in Britain was confirmed this weekend. The wife of a Newcastle haemophiliac has contracted AIDS. Haemophiliacs who have been infected by the virus have now come to terms with the risk of AIDS. But for them, when it comes to factor 8, the choice has always been an unenviable one.
I think the choice is between not using it and having the certainty of pain, discomfort, eventually losing one's job perhaps, being a burden on your family. Against that you have to weigh the very slight risk of AIDS and with it leading a normal life. To me, there is no choice. I wouldn't want to go back to the pre-factor 8 days.
It's a gamble. You may be one of the unfortunate ones. In anything, there's a small percentage risk, you know, that we're going to lose one or two. Well, that's fair enough. I can come to terms with that. My quality of life is such that I've no wish to lower it.
I suppose AIDS, of course, is such a dramatic new development that inevitably you're going to think, well, it doesn't take too long before you realise it's a small risk. Okay, it's another risk on top of hepatitis risk and all the other sort of risks. But the certainty that I know what would happen to myself, my body, if I didn't take the treatment material, that there's no speculation about that. That's not even a risk, that's a certainty.
Ironically, haemophiliacs are facing up to the threat from AIDS just when the goal of self-sufficiency in factor 8 for Britain seems to be at hand. At Elstree, the new plant to supply all Britain's needs is nearing completion at a final cost of £35 million. Production will start next year and full capacity should be reached in early 1987, 10 years after self-sufficiency was first promised. Once that target is reached, imports from dubious donors should end. But already, doubts are being expressed about whether that will happen. The worry centres on the vital raw material, plasma. The blood transfusion service is confident it can supply 2/3 of what is required from existing donors. But Elstree will have to rely for the other third on a new process for collecting plasma, plasmapheresis. Blood is taken from a donor, but only the plasma is retained. The red cells are returned. For Elstree to be fully supplied, plasmapheresis centres must be operating in every one of the 14 regions in England and Wales. But with 18 months to go, only half the regions have even started plasmapheresis. The total output by this method is less than 10% of what will be required if Elstree is to operate at full capacity.
Regional health authorities have many priorities for expenditure. And in some, the expenditure to provide plasma for self-sufficiency has gone on faster than in others. But I think each regional health authority and its transfusion centre is fully aware of the problem and the target date of 1987.
Even though they may not have done too much about it?
At the moment, yes.
I mean, is there any, wouldn't it be a tremendous failing on the part of the blood transfusion service if all the money, the £35 million that's to be spent at Elstree, was spent, and in 1987, when it was in full production, the blood transfusion service couldn't provide the raw material?
Oh, indeed. That would be an unpleasant situation.
What would your reaction be if, after having spent £35 million, which I think is the biggest single commitment that this government has made into the National Health Service as a capital project, we still have to import factor 8?
I'd be quite appalled. But we have planned throughout on the basis that this was going to achieve self-sufficiency. Obviously, 95% self-sufficiency would be disappointing and would contain an element of risk in it, unless we found some new, totally safe source of supply. But at the moment, I think our plans are well-founded. I don't anticipate those problems. I see that the danger, the risk is there. I think we've done everything possible to safeguard against it. And at the moment, I'm not anticipating that we are going to have a shortfall in 1987.
The government is confident that this time self-sufficiency will be achieved, although 10 years later than forecast. But the history of Factor VIII, a story of missed opportunities, mistakes, and decisions taken too late, for which the British haemophiliac and the taxpayer have paid a high price, makes some doctors sceptical.
But certainly in terms of Factor VIII, there will be a continuing shortfall until the supply of material copes with the demand of the material and the projected demand, and thus there will always be a use for commercially available material in this country until these conditions are satisfied.
They have not put resources of staff and finance into the procurement of plasma within the regions. So although it's suggested by government that Elstree will make us self-sufficient, unless source plasma is made available, it can't be self-sufficient, and we are still going to be dependent upon the importation of blood product from the United States.